Hi, all. I'm Mira Jacob. I am a professor here at the writing program, the MFA program here at the New School. And one of my favorite things, actually, about being in a space like this and being on a campus is you remember that time when you were in a place where there were just big ideas in the air. There were big ideas all around you. And you learned something that was so powerful that it changed your life. For me, that was the sentence, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," which is, of course, from the great Audre Lorde, which I will just tell you, when I heard that sentence, I remember going, oh. And so when I think about it now, I think this is why, perhaps despite the many wonderful works that Ta-Nehisi Coates has blessed us with, mine remains this photograph of a whiteboard that he once posted. It was a whiteboard filled with his notes on the case for reparations. It was the trajectory of his thinking and the way that he sort of carved this visionary path from our brutal history to a much better future. Shockingly, that path did not include banning books. But when I think about that, I think for me it was one of the greatest tools I've ever seen a writer give to other writers, and a really extraordinary act of kindness toward anyone seeking to bring about genuine change. So I'm just so glad he's here with us tonight. To introduce him, I'd like to call to the stage Suzanne Nozell, author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, and the CEO of PEN America. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Mira. I'm delighted to be here. This is our 18th annual PEN World Voices Festival, and we're honored to convene some of the world's greatest thinkers, writers, and artists to join us in dialogue. And this is the first festival like this that we've been able to have in 4 years, with this kind of packed room and just the energy and the buzz. And it is wonderful to be here together with all of you. For those who are new to PEN America, we are an organization with a mission to both celebrate and defend freedom of expression worldwide. We have offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., and chapter cities across the country, from Detroit to Tulsa, Birmingham to Miami. Please check your program for more information on how to join PEN America as a member, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. I want to quickly thank our members and our presenting sponsors, the New School, the Creative Writing Program at the School of Public Engagement. I want to share special thanks to the Mayor's Office for Media and Entertainment, the Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts, National Endowment for the Arts, and Amazon Literary Partnership. I also want to share special thanks for the hardworking PEN America Festival team. The PEN World Voices Festival is an island in a roiling ocean, a place for face-to-face, in-person conversation and exploration across political, geographic, ideological, and stylistic divides. For those who live here in New York, the festival evokes what it is that I think first captivated all of us about this city and the life we hope to lead here. For bookstore lovers, it awakens the senses and imaginings you experience poring over shelves and spines. For those of us, all of us who despair over the state of our public discourse, it offers the hope of a reasoned conversation, even a mind or a heart changed. And tonight, I think we're in for all of that. We've been at PEN America for more than 2 years at the forefront of the battle over banned books on behalf of authors, readers, students, teachers, librarians. And as we wage those fights, to be able to have the chance to think deeply, as I know we all will tonight, about the impulses behind book banning, about the complexities of arguments over the harms of speech, is going to be bracing and is going to inform and infuse our work in the days to come. So I'm so thrilled to introduce our 2023 Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecturer, Ta-Nehisi Coates. the author of The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award in 2015, and the Penn Diamonstein Spiegel Award for the Art of the Essay in 2016. He's also the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. The Arthur Miller Freedom to Write Lecture has a distinguished tradition. Arthur Miller was president of Penn International from 1965 to 69, and this lectureship honors his legacy in defense of creative freedom. Ta-Nehisi Coates joins a long line of thinkers, writers, and leaders from around the world, including Arundhati Roy, Umberto Eco, Orhan Pamuk, Salman Rushdie, Colm Toibin, Hillary Clinton, Sonia Sotomayor, Nawal al-Saadawi, and Wole Soyinka, among many others. Following the lecture, we'll welcome David W. Blight, the Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University, on stage for conversation. Questions from all of you will be collected on index cards and shared with Professor Blight. Now, please join me in welcoming Ta-Nehisi Coates to deliver the 2023 Arthur Miller Freedom to Write Lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, what a what an honor to be here. And what an honor to see all you guys here on a night where we have an NBA playoff game. I haven't published a book in quite some time. And so I'm always humbled, and I try to say this every time I speak, that anybody cares that I have anything to say. And while there's some jest behind that, one thing I always tell my writing students down at Howard University, where I'm blessed to teach, is nobody's owed an audience. You have to write, but you aren't necessarily owed the fact that people are going to come and see you. So the fact that you guys have come to hear what little bit I have to say is an honor. I am a writer, and so one of the things I like to do when I do talks like this is use you guys the way a stand-up comic uses an audience, and that is to try to get some ideas worked out. I don't think it's any secret to anybody here that the past, I don't know, well, it seems like ever since Trump, really. So I guess for the past 7 or so years have been a period of intense discussion around book bannings, around freedom of speech, around who gets to say what, around where they can say it, and around how they can say it. And I've been kind of watching a lot of this and feeling a lot of things. But I thought, instead of speaking simply from what I've been feeling, what I've been thinking, that I would use the wisdom of some of my ancestors. Because I think whenever you want to look at a society and you want to ask questions about how broad its freedoms extend, how broad its notions of citizenship extends, I think you can do no better than look at that group of people who have actually been the most marginalized. We don't talk about how great our healthcare system is by looking at the wealthiest people. That would obviously be a foolish test. And so I thought, in consideration of notions of speech, in consideration of this history of book banning, in consideration of this moment that we find ourselves in right now, I would go back to my ancestors, and I would look at this question from the perspective of the enslaved. And my choice, who to begin this conversation with, is pretty obvious and almost a little bit cliche, and that is Frederick Douglass. David obviously is the expert on this and will have a lot more to say than I do, and will get me if I don't quite get this quote contextualized right. But Douglass was a writer. He was obviously many things, but his biggest influence over me, and I would argue even in his creation of who he was in his literature as a writer, in his 3 autobiographies. I believe as David talks about, he was the most photographed man in the 19th century. And so he was a self-created hero. And he's a beautiful, beautiful writer. I actually teach Douglas in my writing classes. And there's a quote that I have always been called back to, that I think about in my time, and I think about it in what I'm trying to do and what my mission is in the world as a writer. And Douglas, in his third autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, as he knows he's dying and he knows he's going into old age, and he's looking back over his history, and he's talking about the point of this book and why this consideration of his life is worth even our eyes. He says of himself, "My part has been to tell the story of the slave. The story of the master never wanted for narrators. The masters, to tell their story, had at their call all the talent and genius that wealth and influence could command. They have had their full day in court. Literature, theology, philosophy, law, and learning have come willingly to their service. And if condemned, they have not been condemned unheard." And that always grounds me, because I always think about like where I'm trying to write from, and I'm trying to write from the perspective of the enslaved, the perspective of the descendants of the enslaved, the perspective of those who have not had literature, theology, philosophy, law, and learning at their command. And I think when you take that perspective, you actually can flip things a little bit and see things about the world that maybe are not immediately obvious. And one thing I think you can see right off the bat is this moment that we are in right now. These debates we are having right now, these conversations we are having right now, despite how much coverage they're receiving in the press, despite how much they're being talked about by journalists, despite what seems like an onslaught of news, despite what seems like an onslaught of controversies at our universities, despite what seems like an onslaught of legislation in legislatures and states across the country, despite my good friend, Nicole Hannah-Jones, finding her work in the mouths of the President of the United States in an executive order, that none of this is actually new. That the war, as I would term it, is actually old. That it's actually older than this country. That the world of literature is, in fact, as old as the slave codes. And so I have to remember that, because I have to, ground myself, before I get too high and, somebody calls me, as has been my experience, and says, "Hey, your book got banned over here. Hey, this teacher got fired because they were teaching something that you did." And I have to remember that, as upsetting as all of that is, that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. That if America, as it's constituted right now, if America, as freedoms and rights are cordoned off in certain ways to certain people right now, if my book, if my work was not considered, dare I say, ban-worthy, then maybe it's not worthy at all. The war is old. The war extends back to 1680, when black people were disenfranchised in Virginia and banned from meetings with other Negroes or other slaves without written permission. The war extends back to bans on literacy of slaves in South Carolina in 1740, Georgia 1755, Virginia 1830, Missouri 1847. The war extends back through Reconstruction, where the main targets of the Ku Klux Klan were churches, schools, and teachers. The war extends through redemption, where our schools were resegregated and defunded. The war extends into the 20th century, where the right to assembly and free speech was under assault by COINTELPRO. And J. Edgar Hoover targeted everybody from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X to Martin Luther King. I know we don't usually think about COINTELPRO as a violation of First Amendment rights, but that's exactly what it was. The idea that because you say something, you are worthy of government surveillance and disruption. The FBI tracked black writers such as Lorraine Hansberry, Amiri Baraka, Langston Hughes, and Chester Himes. The war extends from them all the way up to my father, who was surveyed by the FBI as a member of the Black Panther Party. And then after he left the Black Panther Party, you would have think the FBI would have laid down. But in fact, my dad did something that may have been more dangerous than everything he did in the Black Panther Party. He opened a small black bookstore in West Baltimore. And he was surveyed by the FBI, as were many independent black bookstores across the country, under the order of J. Edgar Hoover. And now it comes to me. And here I am, all of these years later, getting calls, answering emails from people about my books being banned, and not just my books, the books of my friends, my colleagues, and people who are comrades in the war with me. But it helps center us to know that we are part of a long tradition, a long lineage, and also that we ain't that special. Now, against the surveillance, against the harassment and attack on black literacy, there's always been the history of resistance. Covert schools opened in Louisiana in the period of enslavement, where it was, quote, a little short to death for a slave to learn to read. Schools operating in remote swamps and cane brakes. Schools in South Carolina conducted only by night in wretched dark holes in Charleston. Mark Oliver, enslaved in Mississippi, born in 1856, said, "The only book learning we ever got was when we stole it." I love that quote, because it's a reminder of the transgressive nature of learning as liberation, which is the tradition of black writers in this country. So I think when you ground yourself in that perspective of the enslaved, there's a lesson that you can take from that. Not only is the war old, but books are dangerous. And the people who are on the other side of your politics, they know this. I think if anything, maybe sometimes we underestimate the power of books. Tell our kids, go to school, college, get a job. Why don't you major in STEM? Why would you be a poetry major? Poetry's dangerous. Why would you want to write another novel? Novels are dangerous. And I think the people passing these laws know this. And we understand that they know this because their attack on books is not just limited to an attack on books, that they're attacking a suite of rights together. Literature and books is just one part of it. The curriculum is just one part of it. They see it enmeshed in a suite of other rights. And I think maybe we've kind of forgotten that a little bit. I see a lot of discussion of what I would call free speech abstractism. That is to say, the right to free speech disembodied from all the other rights that it necessarily needs to go together. And I don't think we would do that for any other right. I understand that if I have the right to vote, it really doesn't mean anything if I'm not protected by the force of law. I can say I have the right to the ownership of property, but I need other rights to make that a viable thing. If I can't actually contribute to the political process, why does it matter? And so I think understanding these rights is enmeshed together is crucial and really, really important. And to think about that, I think it's worth revisiting another period wherein the descendants of the enslaved found themselves arguing for something that I think would make any writer or any lover of writing or any lover of literature in this room a little uncomfortable, and that is censorship. The year is 1915, and Birth of a Nation is coming out. And liberals and civil rights activists and folks who we would consider as having the right politics find themselves torn. Quote, they hate injustice to the Negro, and they hate a bureaucratic control of thought. The NAACP itself reported all forms of censorship are dangerous to the free expression of art. And yet it was the NAACP and Monroe Trotter, an activist at the time, who tried to get Birth of a Nation banned. And I think our immediate reaction to that is like, why would someone do that? That's clearly wrong. Well, I think what happened afterward kind of maybe bears out their argument. If not bears out their argument, it bears out their motive. At the time, the NAACP and other African-American leaders who argued for this banning said that Birth of a Nation was literally dangerous, that it would endanger the lives of black people. And what ultimately prevailed was the idea that free speech should be upheld, that D.W. Griffith has the right to show this film. The film was shown. It became arguably the seminal film in American cinema. It was pioneering, technically, and it was pioneering politically. It was Birth of a Nation that revived the Ku Klux Klan. The first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was actually defeated in the 19th century. And those who revived the Ku Klux Klan literally cited Birth of a Nation as an influence. Many of the symbols that we sort of associate with the Ku Klux Klan today actually come from Birth of a Nation and come from the book The Klansman, which Birth of a Nation was based on. The Burning Cross, for instance, that's right out of Thomas Dixon, who wrote the book The Klansman. The White Robes, that's right out of the film. Those who refounded the Ku Klux Klan literally cited it as their inspiration. 4 years after that, we got the Red Summer and broad massacres of black people around the country. It turned out, in fact, the film actually was dangerous. Interestingly enough, D.W. Griffith's response for this is hilarious, I'm gonna try not to laugh. D.W. Griffith's response to this was to publish a pamphlet entitled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech, and claimed that motion pictures around the world were enslaved. This is after he's prevailed, by the way. And that move of kind of casting yourself as a victim when you've actually won is quite familiar to some of us. In his pamphlet, he praised the 19th century as an era of free speech. In the way he puts it across, there's a Sedition Act, which happens in the early 19th century, and then after that, free speech prevails, and then when he comes to put out Birth of a Nation, suddenly everybody is upset. He ignores all the history of black people effectively being written out of the society at large, effectively being written out of any right to free speech. Now, one of the responses that often come when we talk about the idea of censorship is the answer that hate speech is more speech. Well, that was tried. In 1920, the great black filmmaker Oscar Micheaux puts out a response film called Within Our Gates. And he is censored. Birth of a Nation isn't censored, he's censored. One way we've thought about this is to say that if one party takes up the tool of censorship, then it is inevitably turned against them. I think that's a little too cute. Because the fact of the matter is there was no redounding effect for banning the free speech of black people in the 19th century. I don't think those people who are banning the books of authors like myself, other authors who are writing about race, gender, sexuality, I don't think the weapon is going to redound against them either. What is the difference? The difference is power. More speech might be the answer to hate speech, but when hate speech has a gun, when hate speech has an army, and so the question I would ask is not that we inaugurate a new movement for censorship, but that we consider the situation that black people were in 1915. What did their other rights look like? Well, 1915, redemption has happened. We've legalized at that point racial zoning in our cities around the country, meaning that you can legally say black people can live here, white people have to live there. There's not a single black person in the Congress. They've been swept out of national representation. In the Jim Crow South, they've been totally and completely, basically deprived of the right to vote. We have a situation that is, basically little more than apartheid. They've been reduced to what one would call a second slavery through debt peonage. There were no rights. There were no other entangled rights. And so to yell free speech at a group of people that have no other freedoms is to yell something incredibly empty and incredibly hollow. Free speech is rooted in freedom. And if there is no freedom, free speech really doesn't have any meaning. I think that is a powerful lesson for us here today. Because one thing I've noticed is that these debates around free speech, around who can say what, who gets to say what, they tend to happen on certain axes. And one of those axes is gender, one of those axes is sexuality, and one of those axes is race. And so if we take it from the perspective of the slave, if we take it from the history of the descendants of the slaves and their relationship to free speech as a right, then I think the natural question is to ask, how free are the people in those categories as compared to the promises that we normally extend to citizens? Well, 58% of women in this country live in a state that is hostile to abortion rights. We have a major political party that is trying to outlaw abortion nationally. We have premier news networks that put people on the air to slander powerful men. Where powerful men slander survivors, and where they're given the mic to justify sexual assault. How free are those who would fall under the realm of sexuality? States across this country passing legislation to banish, and I love this phrase, I saw it on an activist website today, to banish the rights of trans people to publicly exist. Legislation advancing around the country to ban drag shows. Tennessee banning drag shows anywhere in public. And of course, the facts of black life in this country are so oft repeated that I think we become dead to them. But I must remind you that the project of mass incarceration is still with us. And whatever we think, it has deep roots in our tolerance of unfreedom for black people. It is the largest carceral project ever assembled in world history. The movement to curtail the black vote in this country is very much still afoot. But here's the difference. I don't know if there's ever been a moment in history where people were so unfree and also had the ability to perceive their unfreedom. We saw Walter Scott shot in the back. That wasn't witness reports. You can Google it on the internet right now. We saw George Floyd killed. All those agonizing minutes. We really do know that Harvey Weinstein turned rape into an industry. It's clear. The information is right in front of us. We know that we had a president who justifies rape on TV. The awareness is unsettling. We have these hallowed principles that were conceived at a time when freedom was not this expansive and did not include this vast group of people who are so different from each other. And not just different, but have been held out of the umbrella of freedom and rights that we so boast about and tell the world about. Appealing to my ancestry, I think about Du Bois. And in his magisterial work, Black Reconstruction, he talks about the problem of race in the midst of a country that premised itself on so much. And Du Bois says, America thus stepped forward in the first blossoming of the modern age and added to the art of beauty, gift of the Renaissance, and to freedom to believe, gift of Martin Luther and Leo X, a vision of democratic self-government. It was the supreme adventure in the last great battle of the West for that human freedom which would release human spirit from lower lust for more meat and set it free to dream and sing. And then some unjust God leaned, laughing, over the ramparts of heaven and dropped a black man in the midst. And we've dropped trans people into the midst. And we've dropped women into the midst, into all of these divine rights and great things that we say we're about. I tried to think back on my own schooling experience. And I tried to think back, did I feel as challenged as some of the students feel today? Did I have the kind of awareness? Did I feel like I needed a trigger warning? Did I feel like certain topics made me ultra sensitive? And I didn't. And I started thinking about all the experiences that I had. I had a professor come into a class one time and say to us, it was an intro to psychology class, and he says, hey guys, next period in class, you're gonna have a renowned professor who's gonna come in and talk about IQ and human difference. I say, okay. He says, the professor's gonna be William Shockley. We don't know who William Shockley is. I'm 18 years old. I say, okay, all right, cool, we're gonna hear from William Shockley. That following Friday, that was a Wednesday, that following Friday, a professor comes in, and it's him, it's our same professor. And he says, good morning, class, I'm William Shockley. And for the next hour, he, in the most scientific language you can imagine, in the most mathematical language you can imagine, articulates why we, as black kids in this class, are intellectually inferior to white people. And we watched it, and we watched it. And they said, okay, class, and that was it. We come in the next Monday, and he says to us, listen, don't you ever in your life let somebody come in here and do that. Don't you ever in your life let somebody come into your class and talk to you like that and you don't challenge them. And that lesson, I mean, that was, I don't want to think about how old I am, but that was a good 30 years ago, And it stuck with me. I can remember being in, classes on African history and a professor looking at me and saying, so I've laid out all my evidence here. You've heard everything I have to say. Now you explain to me why these black Africans are not inferior. Directly saying that. And I didn't feel the kind of way that kids today feel. We read excerpts of the Bell Curve. They photocopied them for us and said, hey, you should read this. Why was I okay with that? Well, I was at Howard University. I was at a school that had been founded to educate the enslaved. I walked outside and all I saw was other black people around me. I was in class with other black people. I understood I was studying questions intellectually, but I felt free in that environment. It was the freest I'd ever felt in my life, and maybe the freest I've ever felt, period, in my life. And what that meant was all of these questions, which went to the very heart of who we were, somehow there was a freedom to actually explore them. How would I have felt if I was at Harvard and somebody told me they were going to have a guest lecturer as William Shockley? How would I have taken that if I was at Yale, if I was at Georgetown, University of Maryland? I don't think I would have taken it too well. I don't think I would have wanted to sit in a class where the majority of the students are not black and have to have that lecture. I don't think that would be fun. And so I think the thing to understand is free speech, the freedom to have all these intellectual debates, intellectual inquiry, it's rooted in actual things. It's rooted in context. So what is to be done? I think the first thing is to recognize that abstract free speech is bankrupt. I think that's really, really, really important. I think for those of us who are in this room and care about book bannings, we have to ask a question about what else do we care about. I don't think you can care about book bannings and not care about voting rights. I don't think you can care about book bannings and not care about reproductive rights. I think it mocks your commitment to freedom when you only care about a thin sector of freedoms. I think we have to reject double talk. I don't think we can endorse free speech and then claim, as I saw one writer claim, that there are, quote, reasonable and legitimate attractions in the approach of Ron DeSantis. I don't think we can endorse free speech and then, as I saw one writer claim, that book bans are, quote, identity politics for librarians. I don't even think we can equate state legislatures, which are passing bills with all the force and arm of the government, with college students shutting down speakers. I don't think it's the same thing. Now, I also don't think we should just stand by and watch as college students shut down speakers. And I think this leads me to the thing that is most important, the most probably bothersome and provoking thing that I've seen. We got to talk to our young people like they're young people. We got to talk to young people like they're our young people. So much of this seems more like a battle for ego than an attempt to educate. I was reading in the New York Times, and I'm sorry to call this person out. I haven't talked in a while about any of this, so. I was reading in the New York Times a story about a young lady up at Cornell, and she had a friend. And her friend had to read some sort of text that they were reading in class, and she found she was a survivor of sexual assault. And she found the text made her relive the experience of the sexual assault. She found it very, very traumatizing. So she goes to whatever the legislative body is at Cornell, and she tries to pass a recommendation or a mandate that says they have to be trigger warnings in class. And the piece was about how the president of Cornell immediately and loudly shot it down. And I wasn't so bothered by the fact that the president did not want mandated trigger warnings. I was bothered that I was reading about this in the New York Times. I was wondering whether the president had called the two students in and had a conversation with them, had talked to them about whether they felt free at Cornell, whether they felt safe at Cornell. I don't say this as an abstract observer. Like I said, I say this as a professor. I teach all sorts of things. I teach things that come from writers that don't believe me or my students are human. But I always try to have a conversation about that. And if some student says to me, this is extremely, extremely painful to me, my response is not to yell free speech in their face. My response is to have a conversation and see what's underlying that. We got to be sensitive to this generation. They're inhaling a lot. They're cutting on the news and seeing people choke to death on subways. As I was saying earlier, they have an intense, intense awareness of their unfreedom. And part of that, honestly, is the success that writers who folks tried to push to the margin, writers who are now subject to book bans have. It is very interesting to watch as, again, as I mentioned earlier, my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's subject to all of this attention, and yet the 1619 book keeps flying off the shelves. What that means is that they know, and they're trying to find their way in the midst of it. I think of this quote from this book, A Savage War Peace. It's a history of the Algerian War by this historian, Alistair Horn. And he's talking about the very difficult process of young Algerians who have been colonized, being educated in the French system. And as they are educated in the French system, they become more aware of themselves. They become more woke, as we used to say before that word got ruined. And in fact, in becoming woke, in becoming conscious, it turns them against the system. And a young person who is trying to explain the very difficult position that the French system of education has put this young colonized gentleman in, he says, "You have led us to the middle of the ford, and there you have left us." And I just want to encourage us not to leave our young people. I want to encourage us to have more conversations with them and less conversations with the newspapers. Thank you, guys. I didn't get to praise David before my talk.
What's that?
I didn't get to praise you. I meant to praise you before the talk.
No need. He told me earlier, now challenge me.
I did.
Man, I'll try. First of all, thank you for that talk, penetrating talk, riveting talk. You've even got me thinking about my visceral reactions to the idea of trigger warnings. I don't like the idea. I've never used one. I never will. I've never been asked to, but if I am, I'm going to remember your talk.
For the record, I don't either.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's, anyway. We talked on the phone last night, and I just said, so, what are you going to do? He says, I'm taking notes. okay? What about? You know, and we talked about a couple of things, but then I know what I did. I went back to watching the Knicks and the Sixers, so I don't know what you did. You had to give the lecture. Can I respond to the Douglas with a Douglas?
Please.
Just to give you a chance to take that point perhaps even further. Of course, and my bookmark is eluding me. Where is it? There it is. Got it. You know, I love that quote used by Douglas. It's one of the beauties. But Douglas, of course, had so much to say about the power of reading, of writing, of words. Words were all he had. They were his only power. And you know that. But that little section in the narrative, those of you who know Douglas's first autobiography, is as good as anything I've ever read on this. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes. But then comes the really important part. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontent that Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read and had already come to torment and sting my soul with unutterable anguish. And he goes on with that idea of anguish, torment, anguish, torment. And he says the worst thing at that moment to him, this is, of course, Douglas remembering this, but he said the worst thing was the constant thinking that he wasn't free. And that words and knowledge and reading had opened that. Now, he does, it's typical of Douglas, he does convert it in the next few pages to forms of hope out of anguish and what he's going to do with that. But isn't this what's at stake? I mean, in terms of not just the book bannings, but the crusade to control curriculum, the crusade to only teach nice history and pleasant history, and on and on and on. It takes the torment away from students. We don't want them tormented. And I've always kind of felt like that's my job.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And that was one of the reasons why I refer back to my experience. I can't tell you what it was like. So there are two sides of this. Yeah. The first is the agony of when you reach some sort of relative, complete understanding of what has happened to you. So for me, I had this moment after I finished Case for Reparations, long before it was published. But once I was done, I'd done the research and I had the theory. And just so many things that I had thought didn't make sense suddenly made sense. And it was really painful. Because I felt like I had been lied to. And I had just this broad sense of distrust.
You mean with your whole education? Or just...
Yeah, but it was like, I had always felt that, but it was like confirmed. Say that right there. You know what I mean? We were talking about this earlier, but I very informally took, David's class. All of his stuff is it still up there? Is online?
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah. So I took his class through that, and it would, as somebody who had been raised even in my limited upbringing, or my particular upbringing, to really think, yes, the Civil War was about slavery, and then you see, no, it was just that. Like, it's actually painful. But here's the other thing. What I was trying to allude to in that point at how it was to confront the most searing questions that have been put upon you. Jesus. I mean, it was an agonizing experience. And yes, that is what you're supposed to do.
But teaching, it's also choices we make. How much do we tour? And I don't claim for a moment to know what a fifth grader can really handle. I don't do fifth graders or seventh graders. I once did. I once had to for a week. I fled from the, but anyway. So we can't. We don't want to get too high and mighty about knowing what children's. But there's so much evidence now from teachers themselves that kids can handle understanding. I risk a cliche here. They can understand conflict. They can understand hatred. They can understand unfairness. Right. And that's what history is full of. So, okay, I want to take up your Birth of a Nation point just briefly, and then I will try to challenge you.
Just really quickly to that point.
Go on.
I mean, if you're old enough, I feel like if you're old enough to know George Washington was president, you're old enough to know he had slaves. I just think that's,
And the whole world had forms of bondage and slavery. It's better to know that. Anyway. Birth of a Nation. He told me he was going to bring it up last night, so I thought, aha. Not only did the NAACP go after it, as you suggested, but I'm now trying to write a new biography of James Weldon Johnson, who in 1915 hadn't joined the NAA yet. He joins it the next year. But he wrote 2 biting, stinging, brutal essays in the New York Age. He was their principal editorial writer. This is James Weldon Johnson, who was usually pretty graceful, controlled, measured, arguing, yes, ban this film. And his reasons were, it's not just horrible history, it's dangerous. It's dangerous. He ends one of them by saying, ban it, exclamation, kill it. As though it was a beast you had to kill. And again, he's not Monroe Trotter, who was out always making speeches yet. He's a calmer sort. But that film was so horrible. And talk a bit about this, because he's as good a historian as he is novelist and essayist. Ultimately, when a Du Bois or a Johnson or a Trotter and all these people saw that film, they saw their whole history being obliterated, twisted inside out. And I wonder what, if we want to play with our imagination, play with your imagination for a moment. What if this censorship, banning, control of curriculum, make kids only learn nice things really takes over the country? What if they win in 24? And state after state begins to only teach nice history? Can we imagine there will be perhaps new birth of a nations? Maybe less vicious, but still with the same result. History's peddled to young people that have just twisted everything we've written for 50 years inside out. Isn't that what's at stake?
Yeah, that is what's at stake. And I would just going back to the point the speech, probably what will happen is that rollback in history will be accompanied by rollbacks in a bunch of other places too. It'll be a suite of rollbacks. It always runs in concert. And I think one of the things that those actors at EPI, they kind of understood that. They understood that they were, enmeshed together. It's I got to say, when I first encountered that story, it twisted my head at knots. You know what I mean? Because as a writer, you see censorship, you go, you recoil a bit. But then I had this confrontation I had to have with myself. Ta-Nehisi, do you think art and literature is powerful, or don't you? Like you say it is. When it makes you feel good. Can it be powerful when it don't make you feel good? And if you are deprived of all of the rights, when you really have no ability, to, marshal anything else, when you're left isolated in that, what are folks then supposed to do? In addition to the fact, I don't think people quite grapple enough with how intentional Birth of a Nation was.
It's very intentional.
Very intentional. Very intentional. I mean, Griffith says, history's been wrong. I'm going to rewrite
And Dixon had been writing this for 20
Dixon
years.
has been writing this. Woodrow Wilson his quotes are in the film. They don't just screen it at the
Right.
White House. Like they're quotes from who was a historian of sorts before he became president. His quotes are in the film. It was a political act.
Right. Oh,
It
yeah.
very much was an
Yeah,
intentional political, and it was a successful political act.
Can I ask you about the most oft-used word about writing? And it's very relevant to this. Empathy. Now that word, some of us may have grown up with that word feeling like it was, I don't know, a word on a library poster and you didn't have to think about it. But it is ultimately what this craft is trying to do. Cross this boundary, cross that border, get into that experience or another. The word empathy is actually older. I mean, some people say it didn't really get used till after World War II, but actually, David Bryan Davis, one of the historians I knew you sort of came of age reading, finds it first being used in the British anti-slavery movement against the slave trade. The word, he says, really started being used when the Brits had to encounter the horror of the slave trade, and it somehow made them get outside of themselves. I mean, it's worth thinking about that. But okay, empathy. Do you think about that when you're writing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot. But weirdly enough, I probably think about it in the reverse.
All right.
Like, I actually think it's a very great exercise in imagination to put yourself in the shoes of people who have done horrible things
Sure.
and ask yourself, if you were there, would you have done differently?
Mm.
You know what I mean? And in many ways, particularly with the experience of enslavement, like when I talk about it, like
I mean, if you'd have been born white and rich on a plantation in Georgia.
yeah, because you probably are not just born white, rich on a plantation in Georgia. All your peers are rich and white and have plantations in Georgia. And all of them have slaves. All of them. And slaves are not just people who you force into work. Slaves are markers of society.
Yeah.
Slaves are, I hate to, please forgive this metaphor, but slaves are very much what slavery is what we would consider home ownership today.
It's wealth. They're
It's wealth. It marks your arrival. You know what I mean? It's a whole system.
They were assets.
Right. They were assets. And so the question is not, could you, you know what I mean, you yourself with your own individual morality, liberate, you know what I mean, your slaves. The question is systemic. What would your dad say about that? What your best friend say about that? What would your neighbors say about that? Like you would have to reconstitute yourself, in a particular way, and then ask yourself, are you that brave? Like doing it that way is like actually really, really good, and it doesn't excuse it for me. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it like I tend to, when I think about evils, I tend to think about systems more than I think of like lack of individual
Than
bravery.
people. Yeah. Well, maybe I wish you'd do a seminar on how to do that. For my many sins, I'm asked to write the history of Yale and slavery. So I am writing about a lot of people that are hard to like.
You
And
don't gotta like them though.
what's that?
You don't gotta
No,
like
you don't
them.
have to. You don't have to like them.
You gotta like 'em.
But this act of empathy is everywhere. You have to try to figure. Okay, now how do I say this? What kind of adjective do you use to describe Timothy Dwight's racism, or Samuel Morse's racism, and on and on and on? Do you think the empathy challenge is harder in fiction, nonfiction, or is it the same thing for you?
Great question.
Did you not have to think about it in nonfiction when you're writing essays?
No, I always have to think about it.
Okay.
I always, because focusing on individual evil somehow cheapens the story,
Uh-huh.
and it cheapens the lesson,
Yeah.
because it says, and I actually think I think we probably say this a lot, if they were just better people, this would be okay.
Yeah.
But when you start seeing things perpetrate themselves across centuries,
Yeah.
it's probably something more powerful at work. then I just wish they were braver. I just wish they were more moral. Like it cheapens the
Wishing
actual
they
evil.
were something else.
Yes.
Well, I had a student.
And by the way, it deceives you about the sins that are with us today.
Oh.
That people will look back on.
Oh.
You
Well,
know?
I loved your question, what else do we care about? I'd like to come back to that one a little. But I had a student earlier this year in the context of a seminar say in effect about, well, I won't go into the whole context, but she said, but it never should have been that way. And you don't want to chastise a student. It's a visceral moment for her. But we can't wish history into something it's not. And that is a lot of what's going on right now. Why can't history be a place? Why can't history be a place where people get along? Oh, I'm sorry. For other sins, I'm on the board of trustees of the New York Historical Society. I missed most of the meetings, but I was at one meeting a couple of years ago, and one of the members of that board, they have about 35 really rich people and 5 historians. But anyway, he said, and there was a discussion of yet another exhibition that was going to be about tough stuff, difficult stuff. And he said, when are we going to do something that's just about the history where people had goodwill? Goodwill. And all I could do to just stay in my seat. But this is millions of people, want their history, especially for their children.
But the answer to that is yes and no, though.
Oh.
It's also yes and no.
Okay.
Because, and my wife were talking about this, when the gentleman, wherever he was, I can't remember where he was, but older white guy, young black boy, comes and knocks on the door, knocks on the wrong door.
Oh, and you
wrong
got
street,
shot.
and the older guy shoots him, right?
Yeah.
Within a day of them identifying who had done it, that dude's grandson was on TV.
Yeah.
Like, do not associate me with this. It's horrible. It's racist.
I never have liked my grandfather.
I had nothing to do with this. Nothing to do with this at all. And I actually think if you take the empathetic version of that, this is a kid being raised in a time where these books are having huge, huge influence. I mean, gigantic, I hate to keep coming back to this, but 1619 Project is this big, huge thing for the New York Times. Goes on, becomes a book, becomes another big, huge thing. Goes on to Hulu.
Now it's on a documentary. Yeah.
Right, now it's on that. There are people who are living under this. Do you know what I mean? And that's to say nothing of the broader pop culture where, I mean, this just wouldn't have happened when I was a kid. When you got 5, 6-year-old kids, Halloween, I want to dress as Black Panther. It's a different world. It's a very, very different world. And I think this bears out. There has always been a minoritarian or minority rule element to white supremacy. There's always been this group of people who are real, real true believers.
Right.
And then that group of people who you got to keep in line.
Right.
There's always been this kind of border patrolling. And actually, I think when you move to something so profane and so direct as state legislatures and book banning, that means the books are getting read. That means they're really powerful.
Right.
That means your kid came home and talked to you about it and you ain't like it.
Right.
You know what I mean? It is as much a marker of the power.
Yeah.
As and I think what? I mean, this would hold true in Reconstruction and Redemption. It was in fact the advances that actually necessitated the huge blowback.
Right. Well, there's an old sociologist, or I forget, social scientist. I got to be careful who I call old anymore, but Stanley Cohen. He wrote a book called Moral Panics and something Devils. But he built this theory about moral panics, where basically they are when a group of people feels like they're losing control. It's a very interesting theory. People who feel like they're losing social control, And they started identifying deviant. This happened with comic books in the 1950s. It led to congressional hearings. It led to bannings, to some degree, of comic books, which were considered to be the great threat to juveniles. Are we in a moral panic now, particularly over sexuality for sure. In fact, it may be the LGBT issue that has more parents freaked out than anything else. But are we in a moral panic now because of the tremendous changes that have happened in America? Take your pick, 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, even just since the 60s, which began in part under Reagan and now has reached a manifestation where they say all the silent things out loud.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I like that definition. I never heard that definition. That sounds like a great book.
I didn't give it a very good definition. It hasn't.
No, it's
it has a
good.
5-part definition. I'm sparing you. But anyway.
By that definition, I would say yes. And as cliche and easy as this is, I think so much of it goes back to Obama. I really do. Like, if you have to identify a singular moment, I think it's that. And I think a lot of this.
That black family in the White House.
Yeah, I really do. I think it was him, and I think that had effects on publishing. I think that had effect. I know it had effects on magazines and newspapers and who got to tell stories. I know it had an effect on Hollywood and what stories got told. And there's been this, just this rising ever since, to say nothing about the politics, like the symbolic effect of it. I think we, in that moment, thought a lot about pride and how awesome it was to see this.
Right.
And did not consider that a large swath of this country would not think it was that awesome.
I always say 52% were crying on that night in November of 2008 for one reason, 52% for one reason, and 48% for another reason. And anyway, all right, you brought up publishing, so let me try to challenge you a little, if not you, at least. Any publishers here tonight? Editors?
Right there. My publisher's right
Your
there.
editor's here.
He can answer this question. He can come on stage and answer this question.
Okay, well, if you need help, bring him up here. All right, in publishing these days, since 2020, in many ways, according to what I hear, it's become a big issue of who gets to write what, about what. In fiction, also in nonfiction, white writers who can't get a book published if they have black characters, et cetera. There's a particularly famous case right now. James North Patterson, do you know his work? He's written all kinds of bestsellers about crime and law and so on. There's the issue of sensitivity editors or even DEI editors, which is what some textbook publishers call them. I've experienced that with certain consternation. How do you feel about all that? It's easy as writers to just sit back and if we get our book contract, just do our work and keep our head burrowed down. But a lot has happened in the past few years about who gets to write what about what and when. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I do. First of all, I would say that my work would not be possible. Like, I've never had what people would call formally sensitivity readers, but I certainly have had and have been lucky enough to have a fairly diverse pre-readership before something gets published, and I'd be in trouble if I didn't have that. Serious trouble.
Is this more friends who read it for you? Or
no. I mean, the story I
publishing?
was telling. I mean, when we publish, my editor and publisher, Chris Jackson, is here, and he really was my guy on The Water Dancer, and with two black men, working on this together, and we got to a point where other editors in the house, at that time it was two, needed to read it and offer their input, and they were not black men. And I think their input saved my ass. I think they saved my ass. I think I would
How so?
Boy, it's kind of embarrassing.
Now it might get fun.
Yeah, because I'm actually, look, man, like you can do your best to empathize, but you're just not going to get there. The Water Dancer, not to get too much into the plot, but it's this guy, he has this relationship with this woman, and he comes back to the plantation after he's, escaped, and the relationship has become complicated.
Right.
And he is angry at her in the version that did not make publication in a way that I would say was not just deeply unfair for him, but was deeply unfair in how the book was portraying it, because it was written from his perspective. Frankly, dehumanizing is probably not too strong a word.
But they kept calling you on that somehow?
No, they sent me notes. They said, this is fucked up. This is why this is fucked up. This shit is, you should change this. And I was like, damn, that's a good point. So like, now look, I can, look, you need good readers, right? Like you can't just grab any old, you know what I mean? Hey, you're a woman, why don't you read this and tell me? Yeah, that's not how it works, you know what I mean? Hopefully, someone has, some sort of experience in the field, some knowledge of it, some sort of sense, some sort of literary taste themselves. You know what I mean? And then it works that way. So, I haven't had sensitivity, but I guess I do. Even if they don't have that title, I couldn't get anywhere without them. On the broader point, I will, and I'm just speaking as a black writer right now, okay? So I think people can address this. This is the thing I know the best. Man, publishing has been so white for so long.
Oh, yeah. Right.
I mean, just so white. You know what I mean? And again, speaking from other perspectives, people will probably make a similar critique. I'm just not as versed in it. That's the reason why I'm not making it. And whenever you try to, make up for the sins of the past, which may not be done and may not be being done in the most careful way it should be done, I'll say that too, I'll add that to it, people are going to stumble. People are going to stumble. Everything is not going to be as it should be, And what I will say is sometimes we impose a standard of perfection on the solution that we do not impose on the status quo. And so I would ask people to be merciful. I would ask people to be empathetic. I would not ask people to shut up, though. Like I wouldn't ask people to not raise their, their problems. Here's why it's not. That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But I do think there has to be a general spirit that we're trying to address something that was fucked up. And going back is not an option, Now, maybe the way we're going forward ain't right. Like, you know what I mean? Maybe that's not, the way it should be.
Well, there's no question. I mean, there are so few people of color in publishing all over the business. And they're trying, but it isn't working. But down at the level of creativity, the level of imagination, the level of history, scholarship, and there are differences between fiction and nonfiction. But when push comes to shove about the power to decide, you don't get to write this because you are white and creating a Hispanic hero or a Hispanic character, or you are white and writing about a black woman character, which apparently is the case with Patterson. Or for that matter, if a black person were told, you can't, no one was going to tell James Baldwin not to write Giovanni's Room about two white gay men. The book was amazing and a pioneering work. At that point, no one would tell him that. But what happened today? I don't know. Do we sometimes, this is the question, do we sometimes become as Americans so obsessed with identity that we don't see anything else? Especially in this world of creativity.
I think we've been obsessed with identity. But whenever a group has power, part of the power is not having to overtly voice it. You walk into a publishing office and you don't see, well, again, let me take my experience.
Yeah.
I got hired at The Atlantic, which is responsible for much of my prominence. But I walked in there and there wasn't nobody else black in there.
Right.
I would say that's probably an obsession with identity. It might not be an individual conscious, we got to make this place as white as we can, right. Obsession. But they're levels. They're levels. I don't think that happens by accident.
And they put your picture on every article.
All right,
Maybe
at that
they
point, they
always do
put
that, I don't
everybody's.
know.
They put it on everybody's. And they were great. They were great. It was a great job. They were extremely supportive.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? I published things that I don't think I could have published anywhere else. But I don't think demographics like that, and if you walk into a publishing office and see what the demographics look like, somebody along the way is obsessed.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, it may not be the people sitting right there in that, but somebody's obsessed. You know, and one of the difficulties of being on the outside trying to break your way in is you don't have the luxury of always phrasing, framing, stating your critique in that sort of elegant way.
Yeah. I forgot to announce that you are to put your questions on these cards and send them up, but you already did, so that's great. But if anybody has any more, we'll try to get to them. I think this means it's time for questions, right? Yes. Okay. You asked David to push you. What's an example of a question from a student that has really pushed you?
Oh God! Wow. I ended up in a.
Glad you're answering that.
Yeah, it wasn't really it wasn't the question. It was the fact of what it was. I came back to Howard University last year, taught a class with my good friend Eve Ewing over the summer, and then taught another class last fall, and I'll teach again this fall. Because of the demographics of Howard, and because of the demographics of, I would say, most writing programs, last class I taught, I basically ended up in a class. It was 10 students. They were all black women.
Huh.
Every day was a push.
Huh.
Every day. And I don't mean a push like Ta-Nehisi, you sexist kind of push. But every day somebody said something. Because the class is not a lecture. It's not like I stand up and I give speech. It's actually, it's work. I was telling you about this. It's workshop.
Sure.
So more what I'm doing is facilitating conversation amongst them, and what happens is community starts getting formed among them. They become comfortable. They start talking in a way that I'd never been exposed to that. It's one thing to be in a situation where somebody is telling you something.
Were they doing any groupthink on you? Like?
No.
Okay.
I was challenged by their perspective on the world. I was challenged by their experiences, which I kind of knew but had not heard in detail. I was challenged by the rawness of their writing, which I think was in part because of the very demographics of it. I think they felt free.
Yeah.
I don't think if it was 5 young black men in there that class would have went the way it went. That class haunted me.
Wow.
Like I would go home and I would talk to my wife about it. I would walk around thinking about it. I mean, it really, really, really haunted me. And it was great. It was incredible.
Wow. Well, teaching can be haunting anyway. You have a bad class and you know it's your fault.
Well, and if they're writing, they're kind of like that can happen. But if you're writing, they're kind of teaching you too, because their ideas are coming forth. It's not just a one-way, sort of. But just to your point about identity.
Yeah.
I taught a writer who I will not name, but who I love, just adore. It's a white woman. And this is what I love about teaching, man. So I'm teaching, I got a class full of black men. I teach this white woman, right? And there are, other white authors in there, and they read it, and they say, man, this is so distant, and I feel like, it's a white woman's perspective, and da-da-da-da-da. And I listen, I say, oh, you got to read. They read it, you know what I mean? Da-da-da-da-da. And the next week, people started presenting their essays, and everybody had aped her form. Like half of them.
Is that right?
Yeah. But it was, the beautiful part about it is, you have your immediate, like I have experiences. I have my immediate reaction to how I feel.
Yeah.
I have a conversation with somebody about it, and then I go home and I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, it was a great class.
You just reminded me, I've only taught a majority black class 2 or 3 times in my life. And it was the introduction to black studies at Amherst College. I've never had a majority black class otherwise. And it was a different dynamic. And it was intro to black studies. And I was team teaching with a colleague. Well, speaking of your view of the world, here's a question for you. What is the future of black people in red state America? Okay, social commentator. Given the wholesale negation of their mere existence by many people in those states.
I mean, in that sense, the future is the past. I mean, I don't think that's new for, any sort of black person living in, I mean, this is what it is. This is what it is. The future is war, just like the past was war. But that's true in blue state America, too. Again, one of the more horrifying things I saw in the past week was watching people justify why somebody should be able to come up behind somebody else and choke them to death. And I ride the subway. I understand the subway is disturbing, can be disturbing. I understand we got huge problems. I understand it is actually scary. There is a real thing going on. But when that leads you to excusing things like that in a deep blue city, deep blue San Francisco, I saw a guy going around bear spraying unhoused people. I don't know.
Has there ever been a time that you felt some internal conflict using and mastering the English language as a black man? Do you ever feel limited by it in your expression, knowing that it's intertwined in your oppression?
No. I mean, just really quickly, going back to the book I finished on, Alastair Horn's A Savage War of Peace, which is incredible. It's an incredible history that Algerian was just absolutely, and one of the other quotes in that book, and I believe it's from a novel, and basically, guy, again, he's, colonized, being educated in the French system, and guys asking him, aren't you grateful, for this, this French education you're getting? And the guy says, it is not with you but against you that we are learning your language. Yeah. I think that is the history, you know what I mean? Sure. And again, the people passing these laws, just like their ideological ancestors during redemption, just like their ideological ancestors during Jim Crow and during the period of enslavement in this country, they understand that. They are not fooled. They understand the power of books. They understand the power of writing.
Douglas loved mastering the master's language and beating him at it. What is the question you really wanted David to ask you? You pass if you want.
No, what I didn't want, I knew that whatever I was going to come up here and say, I wanted to be challenging, right? There's no point in me being here if I'm not, you know what I mean?
We haven't gotten there yet, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. So when we had to think about somebody who could be an interlocutor. And as much as I was going to try to challenge the audience, I didn't want that person to be in perfect lockstep with me. That's what I wanted to be somebody that I respect. And I really do respect David, and I really do respect his work. I think it's our third time doing this, actually, right? Water Dancer.
It's at least the third time we've done
this. At least.
I owed you.
Yeah. I wanted somebody who I really, really, really respected. So we could have that free exchange of ideas that they say.
Can I recruit you for something?
Maybe.
Maybe, I know. He only comes out once in a while. So, do you do anything with public schools?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I do. Usually when the books are out, we have this.
After the book is out, yeah.
Yeah, we have this real thing when we go in the cities of trying to, because frankly, I've been really blessed with a readership.
Yeah.
And it's really, what am I talking about? I was just in Wyoming and I did a public school. That was like 2 weeks ago. I forgot about that.
Wyoming?
Yeah, I was in Wyoming. Yeah.
See, red states, he goes there.
Yeah, I do. But we really do try to make sure that as much as possible. Good. And whenever I go back to Baltimore, you know what I mean. My mom was a school teacher, so yes, very much so.
Well, I'm on a kick. I'm going to try to recruit you if possible. I think the country needs a moonshot for public schools. I know that cliche gets used too much, but let's be honest. The public schools are in trouble, and this is where the rubber hits the road with this censorship business. It isn't just book banning. It isn't just those librarians who got to empty a shelf. It's curriculum. It's what history is taught. What books are taught. What are kids going to learn? 90% of everyone in a school in this country is in a public school. Some of us get to teach in fancy private universities and so on. And I have nothing against Yale. I'm glad to work there. And they pay well. But the public schools, you went to public schools? It's the most democratic institution this country ever created. What if they die? And some of this effort, well funded by the Koch brothers, is an effort to retard or destroy public schools. They want everybody going to a charter school. They want everybody going to some kind of private school owned by private enterprise. That's your dystopian future if we can't say public school. Now, I'm not going to ask you to, go out and give
I've been thinking about this. This is good.
Schools,
no, this is really good.
We've got it. Those of us that have any voices, we've got to find a way to help the schools, and I'm going to recruit you.
I think also what you just said, would you say it's the most democratic?
Especially since World War II. I mean,
yeah. So much of what
it's linked to mobility for so many people.
Yeah. So much of what the politics are right now from a certain side is really about the destruction of the bonds of society.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As these sort of sites where folks come together. I mean, you can draw a line, I would argue, from this war on public schooling over to this idea that you should just be able to walk into a shop and grab an AR-15.
Yeah.
Like, I think they're part of the same thing. And I haven't quite teased this out yet.
Yeah.
But I strongly suspect it's linked to race and linked to the idea of being in society with people who are so different from you. And it may not be explicit, it may not be direct, but it just feels like it's not a mistake that this assault on society really picks up right after the civil rights movement. Gun buys went up as soon as Obama won. Like that, doesn't feel like it's a mistake,
Yeah. What's our timing? Please, somebody tell me.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Can I ask you to take it out with a little history? We've talked a lot of history before, and Ta-Nehisi's as well-read a person in American history as I've ever met. I have this notion. Tell me if you disagree, that this society has essentially only really ever changed through shock. Shocking events, usually not anticipated, sometimes after long social movements, sometimes after long, great political conflict. But I think, isn't this at the heart of what so many of these Americans who want their children to learn some nice history, isn't this the problem? They don't want to have to believe that we've only really changed through a civil war, a Great Depression, the 60s, the transformation of World War II, etc. And, what do you think about that crazy theory?
I mean, that is one of, wildly enough, one of the...
And we can't always predict them, and in fact, we're terrible at predicting. But
what is more scary is that it's often connected towards war, with war.
True.
Like that the great sort of society, that you can't think about emancipation without the Civil War. You really can't think about the Civil Rights Movement without the Cold War and World War II.
And Vietnam.
Vietnam. These things are... The way I've always interpreted that, though... by the way, this is like one of the insights of critical race theory, too, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous, or why people, fear it so much, because the idea that things don't merely change or even change out of goodwill or good feeling. That they change because Titanic events happen and interests change. That is actually what our history tells us. At the same time, I think because, I've said that before, and the response is, okay, so what are activists supposed to do? Are you saying that they can, they can no change until there's a war? Well, what you're supposed to do is prepare the ground for when the shocking event happens, so you're ready.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It is not the case that, as brilliant as Frederick Douglass was, that, nobody had been that brilliant until him.
Oh,
He
no,
was just there. He was just there when the thing happened. The window opened, and,
Yeah.
that was where it was. I, as depressing as that is, agree with that, actually.
Well, we're all wishing that art and writing and the freedom to create can change the world every day, and it is why we do it to some degree. It's just damned hard.
It is.
But you do it about as well as anybody we have now. So let's thank Ta-Nehisi for doing this tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.